I'm the one who finds things. That's what my job trained me to do. I'm Mara Whitfield, 34, a litigation associate at a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of lawyer who reads a contract 3 times before she signs anything, even a birthday card. Find the clause nobody flagged, find the sentence that doesn't sit right, find the gap between what a document says and what it's supposed to mean. I didn't know that instinct would end up pointed at my own family until the day I stood in a conference room at Whitfield Sons Realty, my father's old company, the one my half-brother now ran into the ground, and watched a faded photograph do more damage than any deposition I'd ever conducted. But before that room, before the silence that followed, there was a folding table in a stranger's driveway, and a man loading my father's army trunk into the back of a pickup truck like it was a box of old paperbacks. "It's just old army junk," Derek said, not even looking at me. Derek, my older half-brother, the one our father's second wife had spent 30 years insisting came first in every room, first in every photo, first in every will discussion no one thought I was old enough to sit in on. He had our father's jaw and none of his patience, and he was selling our dead father's trunk to an estate liquidator for $200, 3 weeks after the funeral, without asking me a single thing. I got there before the man could close the tailgate. I don't fully know what made me open that trunk right there in the driveway, in front of both of them, instead of waiting, negotiating, being reasonable, the version of me that shows up in courtrooms. Maybe it was that Derek wouldn't meet my eyes. Maybe it was some old animal sense that had been quietly cataloging slights for 30 years and had finally run out of patience for politeness. I flipped the latches, and underneath a folded flag and a shoebox of medals, there was a photograph I had never seen in my life, a woman, dark-haired, laughing at something outside the frame, and on the back, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, a name. One name. And when I read it out loud, Derek's face did something I had never once seen it do in 3 decades of watching him perform ease in every room he walked into. He froze. To understand how it came to this, you'd have to go back to a version of our family that existed long before that driveway, back to 2 kids growing up under the same roof with 2 very different sets of rules, and a woman at the head of the table who made sure everyone understood, without ever quite saying it out loud, which one of us actually belonged. Growing up, our house ran on an economy of small, deliberate imbalances. Derek got the bigger bedroom because he was the oldest, even though I was only 14 months behind him. Derek got driving lessons on his 16th birthday. I got a bus pass and a comment about how independence built character. When Derek brought home AC and algebra, our stepmother, Linda, my father's second wife, the one who redecorated every room in the house except mine, framed it as he's just not a numbers person, that's fine. When I brought home a B+ in the same class, she asked what happened. I used to think I was imagining the pattern. I wasn't. I was cataloging it, quietly, the way you catalog evidence before you know yet that you'll need it. My father, Frank Whitfield, was a Vietnam veteran who ran a small realty company out of a strip mall office with wood paneling that never got updated, and he loved both of us. I believe that. Actually, I've never doubted it. But he was a man who avoided conflict the way some men avoid doctors, letting things fester rather than have the conversation that might fix them. He'd catch my eye sometimes across the dinner table when Linda said something sharp about my attitude or my sensitivity, and he'd give me this small, apologetic almost smile that meant I see it too and also meant I'm not going to do anything about it. I learned early that love, in that house, didn't always come paired with protection. So I built my own. I got a scholarship to a state school 2 states away, and I took it, and I didn't cry at the going-away dinner even though a part of me wanted someone to ask me to stay. Law school after that, on loans and grit, and then the associate track at a firm that valued exactly the thing my family never had: precision, preparation, the refusal to let an unexamined assumption slide past you. I made partner track by 29. I won a breach of contract case at 31 that got written up in a local business journal, a case where I'd found a single misplaced comma in an indemnification clause that changed the entire liability structure of a 7-figure deal. My supervising partner told me afterward that I had the best eye for the gap in the room he'd seen in 15 years of practice. I didn't tell him that I'd been training that I since I was 7 years old, watching a woman divide affection like it was a limited resource, and I was always somehow last in line. Derek, meanwhile, drifted through 2 years of community college, dropped out, and slid into a management role at our father's realty company that mostly consisted of golfing with clients and letting the actual brokers do the work. Dad never said a bad word about it. Linda called it learning the family business, the way it's meant to be learned, from the ground up, with family behind you. I used to wonder, in my more honest moments, whether the ground Derek was learning from was even the same ground I'd been standing on my whole life. The one person who never treated me like the spare part in that family was my cousin, Renee, my mother's sister's daughter, 3 years older than me. The kind of person who showed up at my law school graduation with a homemade sign and cried louder than anyone in the section. Renee had watched the whole dynamic unfold from just outside it, close enough to see clearly, far enough to say what she saw. "You know they're not being fair to you, right?" she asked me once. We must have been 16 and 19, sitting on the hood of her car outside a family barbecue we'd both stepped out of to breathe. It's not paranoia. I see it too. I don't think I fully believed her back then. It took me another decade to stop making excuses for people who'd never once made excuses for me. My father died in March, quietly, in his sleep, the mercy of an ending nobody in that family particularly deserved. And it was at the funeral, watching Derek accept condolences like a man accepting an award, watching Linda position herself at the front of every receiving line while I stood 2 feet back like a coworker rather than a daughter, that something in me finally, quietly, decided I was done watching. I didn't make a scene. I've never been a scene maker. I went home that night and did what I do best. I started building a case, not against a company this time, not for a client. For myself. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded a great deal like a junior associate combing through Discovery kept whispering, "Something about this doesn't add up, and you know it doesn't, so go find the gap." The estate wasn't complicated, on paper. The house went to Linda. The realty company, on paper, was split evenly between Derek and me, Dad's one real act of stated fairness, though I noticed Derek was already behaving as though split evenly meant mine, with some paperwork I'll deal with later. What struck me wasn't what was written. It was what was missing. My father had been a meticulous man about certain things. His tools were labeled, his files were dated, his tax records went back further than the IRS could legally ask for. But there was no life insurance policy in the estate paperwork, despite the fact that I distinctly remembered him mentioning, offhand, years earlier, that he'd taken care of things for both of us. There was no accounting of a military survivor benefit that a man of his service record should have had. And there was a trunk, his old army trunk, the one he kept in the garage and never let anyone open, that Linda wanted gone within the month, and that Derek, without a word to me, arranged to sell. I didn't confront him about the trunk directly. Instead, I did what I do for a living. I got quiet, and I got methodical. I requested a copy of the estate file from the family attorney, an old colleague of my father's named Walter Ostrander, framing it as simple due diligence on my half of the company, which it was, technically, not a lie, just not the whole truth. I pulled county property records on my own time, cross-referencing dates. I found a name on an old beneficiary form from 20 years back that had since been updated, Walter's word, delivered with visible discomfort when I pressed him to reflect a more current family structure. I asked Walter, very calmly, in my best deposition voice, who had requested that update and when, and he looked at me for a long moment before he said, quietly, "Mara, I think there's a version of this you don't know yet." I told him I was patient. I told him I'd wait for the right room to find out. Derek didn't know any of that was happening. He thought the trunk was the only loose thread, and he thought he'd already cut it, right up until I stood in that driveway and pulled it open before the liquidator could load it, and found, tucked into a false-bottomed compartment beneath the metals, a manila envelope my father had clearly hidden on purpose. Inside it, an old insurance policy naming a beneficiary who wasn't Derek, wasn't Linda, and wasn't fully me either. Not yet, not until I understood what I was looking at. And inside that envelope, held between 2 folded letters, was the photograph. a woman I didn't recognize. And on the back, my father's handwriting, faded but legible. Catherine, my wife, mother of my daughter, forgive me for the silence. Everything goes to Mara. She was always the one who was real. Derek read it over my shoulder before I could stop him, and that's when I watched him freeze, not confused, not surprised the way you are by something genuinely unexpected, but frozen the way a person freezes when a fact they've been actively managing for years finally slips out of their control. Because it turned out Catherine wasn't a stranger to him. It turned out Derek had known, for at least a decade, that Linda was not my father's first wife, that my father had been married once before, to a woman named Catherine Ruiz, that they'd had a daughter together, and that Catherine had died young. In circumstances the family had spent 30 years quietly not discussing, letting a vague story about complications stand in for a truth nobody wanted to touch. Derek had known, and more than that, Derek and Linda had known that the more current family structure update to my father's beneficiary paperwork had been done not by my father's clear wish but by Linda. Using a power of attorney she'd pressured him into signing during a hospitalization 8 years earlier, back when he was weak and frightened and not thinking clearly. They had quietly rewritten who I was allowed to be in that family's official record, and they had done it while I was 3 states away, building a career out of catching exactly that kind of thing for strangers. It's not what you think, Derek said, in the driveway, his voice cracking in a way I'd genuinely never heard before. I don't think anything yet, I told him, and I meant it, the old instinct kicking in, the one that says don't argue the case before you have the full record. But I intend to find out. What followed was 3 weeks of the quietest, most careful work I have ever done, quieter than any case I've ever built for a client, because this time the person I was protecting was myself, and I could not afford to get it wrong. I went back to Walter Ostrander with the photograph and the letters and asked him, formally, to pull my father's full estate history, every amendment, every notarization, every date the beneficiary designation had changed. I requested the hospitalization records from 8 years earlier, the ones that would show exactly when that power of attorney had been signed and under what conditions. I had a forensic document examiner, a woman named Priya I'd used on 2 separate cases at the firm, compare my father's handwriting on the hidden letter against 3 decades of verified samples, to make absolutely certain that the words "everything goes to Mara" weren't something Derek or Linda could later claim I'd fabricated. I found, buried in an old filing cabinet at the realty office, a life insurance policy from 1998 that had never been formally canceled, only superseded, Walter's word again, by paperwork executed while my father was recovering from a stroke and, according to his own attending physician's contemporaneous notes, intermittently confused regarding recent events. I told no one but Renee what I was building. She sat with me one night while I laid the documents out across her kitchen table in the order I intended to present them, and she looked at the photograph of Catherine for a long time before she said, quietly, "She has your eyes." I hadn't let myself notice that yet. I noticed it then, and something in my chest, some old locked room, finally let a little air in. I asked Walter to schedule a formal estate review meeting, not a family dinner, not a let's talk this through conversation over coffee, but an official session in his conference room, with Derek and Linda both required to attend because the realty company's ownership structure was formally on the table. I didn't tell them why I wanted the meeting. I let them assume it was about the business. It was, in the end. Just not the way they expected. The conference room at Ostrander Klein smelled like old coffee and printer toner, the kind of room I'd sat in 100 times for other people's disputes and never once for my own. Walter sat at the head of the table with a manila folder in front of him that I knew held copies of everything I'd handed over. Linda arrived in a blazer that looked like armor, already annoyed at having her Tuesday interrupted. Derek sat across from me, jaw tight, and I understood, watching him, that some part of him had spent the last 3 weeks hoping the driveway had been the whole of it, that I'd read one photograph, felt one wave of shock, and moved on the way I always had before. "I want to start," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to, the courtroom register kicking in like a reflex, with a question. Who requested the 2016 amendment to Dad's beneficiary designation on the Meridian Life policy? Linda's jaw tightened first, before Derek's did. That's not relevant to a business meeting about the company, she said. It's entirely relevant, I said, because that amendment is the only reason there's a dispute about the company at all. I laid the first document on the table, the original 1998 policy, Catherine's name on it as beneficiary until her death, my name added afterward as sole beneficiary in my father's own hand. Years before Linda ever entered the picture. Then the 2016 amendment, executed 3 days after my father was discharged from a stroke recovery unit, his signature visibly shakier than it had been even a year earlier. Then the physician's notes describing his cognitive state that week, intermittently confused, disoriented as to recent events, notes Walter confirmed, on the record. He had never been shown at the time the amendment was filed. Derek's hands were flat on the table, very still, the way mine go still in a deposition when I know the next question is the one that breaks the case open. And this, I said, laying the photograph down last, face up, Catherine's laughing face looking out at all of them, is the woman Dad hid in a trunk for 30 years because none of you would let him grieve her out loud. Her name is Catherine Ruiz. She was his first wife. She was my mother. And she died when I was 2 years old, in an accident this family has spent 3 decades calling complications because the truth was inconvenient for the story Linda wanted to tell about who came first. Nobody in that room said a word for a long moment. Walter, to his credit, simply turned the folder toward the center of the table and said, quietly, formally, that in light of the documented evidence of diminished capacity at the time of the amendment, combined with a subsequently discovered, handwritten, dated, and forensically verified statement of my father's original intent, he would be filing to have the 2016 amendment invalidated and the estate distribution reverted to the terms my father had set, in full possession of his faculties. Decades earlier, before anyone had ever pressured him into anything. You knew, I said to Derek, finally, my voice quiet now instead of steady, because the steadiness had done its job and I didn't need it for effect anymore. You knew about Catherine. You knew about the amendment. You let me spend 30 years thinking I imagined the difference in how this family loved us. I didn't write the story, Mara, Derek said, and his voice had lost all its old ease. I just didn't correct it. That's the same thing, I told him. It was just quieter. The company reverted to my sole ownership within the quarter, not out of vindictiveness, but because the original partnership paperwork my father had drawn up, before Linda's amendments, had always named me as majority holder. A fact everyone in that family had simply agreed, silently, never to mention. Derek kept a minority stake and a management title he no longer treated as a birthright. Linda stopped calling. 9 months later, I run Whitfield Realty out of the same strip mall office my father built it in, though I've since had the wood paneling replaced with something that lets in more light. Renee handles our client relations now, which mostly means she gets to be loudly, publicly proud of me in a way nobody else in my family ever managed, and I've stopped needing anyone else's version of that. I keep the photograph of Catherine on my desk, in a proper frame now, not folded into a hidden envelope in the bottom of a trunk. I found, going through the rest of my father's boxes at my own pace, dozens of small things he'd saved of hers, letters, a hairbrush, a child's drawing signed Mara, age 2, proof that he never stopped grieving her. He just never found the courage to make room for that grief out loud in a house that had already decided which story it preferred to tell. Derek texted me last month. Just a few lines, that he hoped I was doing well, that he'd been thinking about Dad, that maybe we could get coffee sometime. I read it twice, the way I read everything, looking for the gap between what it said and what it meant. There wasn't one this time, or maybe there was, and I've simply stopped needing to find it. I told him I was glad he was doing okay, and that I wasn't ready for coffee yet, and that was true, and I let it be enough. I used to think being the outsider in that family was a wound I'd carry the shape of forever. It turns out it was just training, 30 years of learning to notice exactly what people hope you'll overlook. My father left me more than a company in that trunk. He left me proof that he saw me the whole time, even when he didn't have the courage to say it out loud while he was alive. I didn't need Derek's coffee, or Linda's apology, or anyone's permission to finally take up the space I'd always been entitled to. I just needed the truth, written in my father's own hand, and the nerve to open the trunk before somebody else could carry it away. If this one hit home for you, you know exactly why. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet ones who turn out to be the strongest voice in the room. I've got plenty more where this came from.